Okay, this is a story that's been told most in our family for probably about 200 years. It concerns an ancestor of ours who lived in Portland, Pennsylvania, where it's called Dill's Ferry then, where his father had a little ferry across the Delaware River and built a little tavern and overnight inn for the travelers. He had a son who, when he was a teenager, an older level teenager, got a little hot-headed and left home. He didn't tell anybody. It was this boatman who was carrying his goods down the river to Philadelphia offered to pay him to row him back. Um, didn't really need to row much, didn't need to be very strong to go downriver, but to go back, you needed a strong person. So they went downriver and unloaded the goods, and he was just laying on the dock at night, waiting to start off in the morning back to his home. Well, a British naval ship was parked there, and they came and grabbed him and took him aboard and left port during the night. Um, so he was impressed seaman, they call him. So he took his shoes and his shirt and his belt and whatever money he had, which wasn't really very much. And so he was unlikely to escape. And I guess many young men just decided to accept this as, their new job. But he didn't. He didn't want to be a British sailor. So the next port was Baltimore. And I don't know how long it was, maybe just a day or two. I just don't know how long it takes to go from Philadelphia to Baltimore by sailing ship. But anyway, we got to Baltimore. They docked off land, and then they rowed the captain and the soldiers who were going in by a small boat, left him and the guard there. But he decided to jump ship. He jumped over ship and he swam to the Baltimore side of the Chesapeake, which is what was closest to them at that time, obviously. And he tried to get out of town as quickly as possible so he wouldn't be caught again. Well, he wasn't very good in geography, so he decided to walk back along the Schuylkill River, which does eventually go back close to where he lived, but it's not the shortest route by any means. He should have just crossed the Chesapeake there and going up the main road to Philadelphia and then back up. Probably get a ride rowing back to his home. But anyway, he started out and he would get little jobs working the farms or something to earn his keep. He'd stay a few nights and people would let him sleep in the barn. But he still didn't have any shoes. He got a shirt, I guess, somewhere and a jacket from somewhere. Maybe he stole them, I don't know. But anyway, when he was going along, he met somebody and he told him his name was Dill. And the guy said, "Oh, yeah, there's a Dill that has a tavern over here, not too far from the river in Dillsburg." So he thought, well, maybe this is a relative. He was sort of isolated back then. He didn't see his relatives often, but the name Dill and the fact he lived and have a tavern made him think, well, maybe they're related. So he did the extra trip to go from the river over to Dillsburg. And met the Mr. Dill, and they were talking, and they were talking about relatives, and they seemed to have some names in common, but they didn't know quite how they matched up, but they thought at that time that this was a relative, which was good because then he was particularly generous, and he gave him, old Mr. Dill with the tavern gave the young man his extra pair of shoes. This is how the story got transmitted over all these years because it's about shoes. And my grandfather fixed shoes, and he told this story in his every now and then. So there was an advertising thing why you want to have an extra pair of shoes. You never know when some stranger's going to walking by and need a pair of shoes. And he heard that from his grandfather named Charles Hepburn Dill, who was also a shoemaker. So they didn't hear this story just once or twice. They heard it many times a year over a 40-year career. He's probably heard it at least 100 times. And my grandfather heard it 100 times. And I unfortunately heard it 100 times from my father. But anyway, he got his boots and he continued on. And it was wintertime. Got very cold, and he had no place to stay. He got really into the wilderness along the river a while. But there had been a flood on the Susquehanna that year, and there was a part of a log cabin, just like two walls, they described. It's a small thing, like 10, 12 feet, but the bow's long, laying along the river. So he dragged it up just under the dry part and slept there through the cold part of the winter. Continued on back home, and his family was very surprised to see him. They thought he was gone for good because they didn't do anything about it. But anyway, this story was told many, many times just because of the shoe aspect of it, and the fact that they were shoe repairmen. That's it.
Did you say something about how later on, how they figured out?
Oh, okay. Yeah, this was much later. That's what happened back and this story happened, we believe, sometime between 1800 and 1810. Just because of the ages of the people, we don't know anymore exactly when it was, because he doesn't have a really British service record or anything to go on, because he was only there 2 days. You probably gave him a false name. Anyway, this is an interesting story, and as I say, my grandfather heard it many times, and his grandfather told it many times. So the man in between, my great-grandfather named Frank Smith, heard the story also. And at one point in his life, he became a traveling salesman for a furniture making company. His home was in Pennsylvania, but he traveled all the way down to Washington, D.C. in a little circuit. So he decided he'd like to go to Dillsburg, see what it's like. And it came, I don't know if he actually had a store in Dillsburg, but he came close. It wasn't a big deal to go there. So he went there, and turns out there were no Dills living there anymore. They were all gone. So we asked around, does anybody know the history? And, and there was an old man here, the way he described it, he was like in his 90s and, remembered everything in the town hall. So my great-grandfather asked him about this person that walked up there. And I said, oh, yeah, old Mr. Dill used to talk in the tavern about this relative who walked up from Baltimore with bare feet. So anyway, at that time, he still couldn't figure out if we were related or not to the Dills who lived there. And that was around the time of the First World War. So in the after 2000, around 2000, James Dill, who was a relative, but not a close relative, was going around doing research on the family, and he stopped by. And he came to the store where I was still working, and we talked for about 2 hours. And he gave names, and he said he couldn't figure it out either. And I said, well, I can't figure it out. But just then we were starting to have the internet, and we could look up things and find out. And it turns out that we discovered the Dill in Dillsburg was an Irish ancestry. And our Dill was actually changed his name from Dilt to Dill. It was a German, ancestry. So at that point we realized this couldn't have been a relative he stopped for. And that's the last I've heard of it.
Okay.